Hey guys, I just wanted to sort of apologize for the length of this video. Somehow this video ended up being 47 minutes long. That wasn't really my intention, but it somehow happened that way. But I do hope you watch the entirety of this video. But I also want to point out that of this 740-minute long video, only the first 25 or 26 minutes is me actually talking about the novel. The rest of the video from then on is me talking about the tremendous legacy that this novel has left behind. I also want to give you fair warning that when it got to the point where I talked about the movie Nosferatu, for some reason I kept calling it Nosferatu, even though there's no D at the end of that word. That was a fuck up on my part, and I just want to apologize for that in advance, and there's no reason to point that out to me either. Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Dracula by Bram Stoker. Now, I actually did do a review of this book a number of years ago, actually 5 years ago to be exact. 5 years ago, I did a little special called Dracula Week, where I reviewed this novel, and then I reviewed several film adaptations of this novel. Now, most of my reviews of the Dracula movies I did for Dracula Week are still up on YouTube, and you can watch them on a playlist entitled Dracula Week, but I decided to take down my old review of this book because I felt like there was more I could say about this book, so I decided to take down my old review and re-review the novel. Now, Dracula was published in 1897, so the book is 120 years old now, and this has gone on to become one of the most influential, not just horror novels, but novels in general. Like, everybody knows the name Dracula. Like, you could go anywhere in the world, and the minute you say Dracula to somebody, they'll instantly know who you're talking about, even if they've never read the book or don't even know that the character of Count Dracula originated from a novel. They'll immediately know who Dracula is the minute you say Dracula to somebody. Like, Dracula, the character, has really become a part of not just popular culture, but culture in general. And I think more people know about the character of Dracula than they actually know about the original novel, or even Bram Stoker himself, and I think that's both a good and bad thing. It's a bad thing in the sense I think more people should read the book and know where it all started, but it's a good thing in the sense that I feel like that's the ultimate goal an author could achieve, to create a character whose fame literally outshines your own fame. And even 100 years from now, people are still going to know the name Dracula, even if the book ends up falling into obscurity, which it hasn't yet, because this is still a widely read novel, but I'm just saying, like, even if the book does fall into obscurity, people are still going to know that name. And as far as 19th century horror literature goes, besides something like the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, which of course are very influential, I want to say that the three most influential horror novels of the 19th century are Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, and Dracula. Now, a lot of people compare this book to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which technically isn't fair because they're two completely different stories, and Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein years before Bram Stoker was even born, so really it's not fair to compare the two stories. But the reason people compare the two novels is because both these novels have had such a tremendous influence on Western culture, and also in the 20th century and even into the 21st century, some of the adaptations of both Frankenstein and Dracula have sort of crossed over with each other, so you could see why people today compare these two novels, even though they're two completely different books. And I'm pretty sure Bram Stoker did not even remotely have Mary Shelley's novel in mind when he wrote wrote this book. But oddly enough, Bram Stoker's mother actually said in a letter to her son about this novel, now I'm paraphrasing here, but she basically said that this was the best horror novel since Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So even back when this novel was first published, his mother was comparing this book to Frankenstein, and in a weird way she sort of predicted how both these novels would become extremely influential in the 20th century. Now, even though I don't think it's necessarily fair to compare this book to Frankenstein, if I were to compare the two books, personally I like Frankenstein a lot better. I think Frankenstein is just a better book. I think it's a far deeper, far more philosophical, and far more intellectually driven book. And I also think Frankenstein has a far better story than Dracula, but that's just my opinion, and whether one is better than the other might really depend on what you personally look for in a novel. But once again, I don't think it's fair to compare the two books, but if I were to compare them, I do think Frankenstein is the better book. Now, of course, Dracula was not the first vampire story, and there have been vampire legends throughout human history, but ever since this novel was published, this has in a lot of ways become the definitive vampire story. And honestly, I don't think there is a vampire story written after Dracula that wasn't in some ways influenced by this novel. Once again, this has really become the definitive vampire story, and the name Dracula has become synonymous with vampirism. Now, throughout human history, almost every culture has had their own legends of vampires, but Stoker primarily draws from European vampire folklore. And believe it or not, there was a time hundreds of years ago in Europe when people genuinely believed in vampires, and believe it or not, people were accused of being vampires and executed the same way people were accused and executed for being witches. Now, there is an 1819 short story entitled The Vampire, written by John William Polidori, which may have had an influence on Dracula, and this was the first story where a vampire was depicted as an aristocrat. Now, Polidori, if I'm saying his last name right, based the vampire from this story off of his friend Lord Byron, who was also a well-known poet and writer from around that time. And to make another Frankenstein connection, both Polidori and Lord Byron were friends with Percy and Mary Shelley, and both Polidori and Lord Byron were with Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley. Well, technically she was Mary Godwin at the time because this was before she married Percy Shelley, but they were with them on the night that Mary Shelley, or Mary Godwin, conceived the idea for Frankenstein. So if Stoker did take some inspiration from the Polidori story, that's another weird little Frankenstein connection you got going on there. Stoker might have also taken some inspiration from the short story Carmilla, which was about a vampire woman, which was written by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, and I'm sure somebody who actually knows how to pronounce his name just committed suicide right now, but once again, Stoker might have also taken some inspiration from this short story as well. But once again, even though Dracula was not the first vampire story, this is the one that people look to when they think vampire stories. Now, Stoker took the name Dracula from a real-life historical figure known as Prince Vlad Tepes III, or Vlad Dracula. Now, Vlad Dracula was a warlord who ruled much of Transylvania, which is a part of Romania, back in the 15th century, and he was known for his cruelty, and it's widely believed that he impaled his enemies on wooden stakes, giving him the nickname Vlad the Impaler. Now, while many historians believe that Vlad Dracula was a vicious tyrant, if you go to his native Romania, he's viewed as a hero. Now, contrary to popular belief, Stoker did not base the entirety of this novel off of Vlad the Impaler. He only took the name Dracula from the 15th century warlord. Stoker actually already had the outline for this novel done before he even found out about Vlad the Impaler. In fact, the vampire from this story was originally going to be called Count Vampire. Now, Bram Stoker actually based a lot of characteristics of Dracula off of a well-known stage actor from the time named Sir Henry Irving, who was friends with Bram Stoker, and Bram Stoker actually worked as Irving's manager. In fact, Stoker actually wrote this novel with the intention of adapting it for the stage, and he actually wanted Henry Irving to play Dracula in a stage adaptation of his novel, but during a reading of the novel at the theater where both him and Sir Henry Irving worked, Irving had only one word to describe the novel, and that was dreadful. And there is sort of a strange irony to the fact that the man who, for all intents and purposes, inspired Dracula has now fallen into obscurity, whereas the character of Dracula is now known universally. Now, I can't say this for sure, and I might be reaching here, but I do think it's possible that Stoker might have at least loosely based the villain of this novel off of real-life serial killer Jack the Ripper, and the Jack the Ripper killings only happened a few years before this novel was published. Once again, I might be reaching there, but it also wouldn't surprise me if Stoker maybe took some inspiration from the real-life Jack the Ripper killings. Now, as to my actual thoughts on this novel, as I said before, I personally think Frankenstein is a much better book, but once again, it's not really fair to compare the two novels because they are completely different stories, but overall, I have to say that I have mixed feelings on this book. I do think it's a good book overall, but at the same time, I also think it's very slow-moving, and I normally don't complain about stuff like that, but this is one of those rare cases where I would actually say that this book is overlong. Like, I actually think Stoker, or Stoker's editor, could have cut out a good 50 pages from this book, and honestly, I don't think it would have affected the story too much. And honestly, I think that would be my main criticism of the novel, is it is a little too long, and I rarely make that sort of criticism because I've always maintained that a book should be as long as it needs to be, but in the case of this novel, once again, I think it's longer than it needs to be. I do think this book would have benefited from being shorter, and it is a little slow-moving too, but once again, even though I have problems with it, I would say overall, I still think it's a really good book, and I do recommend giving this book a read. And this is a book where even if you don't like it, and I can understand if a person doesn't like this book, you do have to respect the novel because of how much of an impact this novel has had on literature, on movies, and on culture in general. Now, despite my mixed feelings on this book, I actually do think the writing style of the novel is actually quite brilliant, because the book is written in the form of diary entries and newspaper clippings and letters sent back and forth between different characters. The writing style in this novel is actually very similar to, if you've ever read Stephen King's Carrie. Carrie is written in a very similar style, and Stephen King would probably be the first to admit that he probably took the writing style of Carrie from this book. So once again, despite my mixed feelings on the book, the writing style is one of the things I do really like about the book. And one really interesting thing about the writing style in this book is you get to see what the characters think of each other, and you get to see things from different characters' perspectives. Now, the plot of Dracula is it begins where this real estate agent named Jonathan Harker goes to Transylvania to meet this count named Dracula who wishes to buy property in London. But when he gets to Transylvania, he tells the locals where he's going, and the locals warn him against going to Dracula's castle. But Harker sort of just shrugs this off as being native superstition, and he goes to Dracula's castle, but when he gets there, he notices these strange, seemingly supernatural occurrences happening at the castle, and soon it's revealed that Dracula is in fact a vampire. So in the book, Count Dracula holds Jonathan Harker hostage at his castle, and then he goes to London, and while in London, Dracula starts preying on this young woman named Lucy. Now, in the novel, while Dracula is preying on Lucy, Lucy of course has no idea what's actually happening to her, and neither do her friends and family, but it appears that Lucy is getting very sick, and a friend of hers named Dr. Stewart, who actually has feelings for her, doesn't know what's happening to her, and he ends up contacting his friend and mentor, Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, and Van Helsing knows exactly what is happening to her. Eventually, you find out that Jonathan Harker escaped from Dracula's castle, and eventually Dr. Stewart and Van Helsing meet Jonathan Harker and his wife Mina, who is actually a close friend of Lucy, and eventually they find out about Count Dracula and what Dracula is doing in London. And Dracula starts going after Mina, and in the story, Harker, Dr. Stewart, Van Helsing, and Lucy's husband Arthur, and an American named Quincy all team up to try to hunt down and destroy Dracula before it's too late. And that's the basic plot line of Dracula. Now, in this novel, I want to say that the three most iconic characters from this novel are, of course, Dracula, who has really gone on to become one of the great literary villains, but you also have Abraham Van Helsing, who has really gone on to become sort of like the quintessential vampire hunter in popular culture. But another really iconic character in the story is Renfield, who is this mental patient who Dr. Stewart takes care of, and it turns out that Renfield knows about Dracula and actually worships Dracula as sort of a deity, and in some ways Renfield is sort of Dracula's familiar in a lot of ways. And Renfield really is an interesting character because he is sort of a secondary antagonist in the novel. At the same time, though, the book does paint him as being somewhat sympathetic, and the other characters in the book do regard him with compassion. And in some ways, I would argue that this book deals with the issue of mental health in a very compassionate manner, where even though Renfield is sort of a villain in the story, the book still wants you to feel sympathy for him. Now, the character of Count Dracula really is a very interesting villain because in some ways he represents both Christ and the devil. He represents Christ in the sense that he's literally offering his body and his blood, and if you take Dracula's blood, you're granted eternal life, much like how it says if you take the blood of Christ, you're granted eternal life. Of course, the Bible means that you're granted eternal life in heaven, whereas Dracula, you drink his blood, you're granted eternal life on Earth. So in some ways, Dracula in this novel sort of represents a perverted parody of Jesus Christ. But Dracula also sort of represents Satan in this novel because if you do give in to him, you're damned for all eternity. And there's also a part of this book where Renfield is telling the other characters something that Dracula said to him, and what Dracula says to him is very similar to what the devil told Jesus in that story from the Bible of the devil trying to tempt Jesus. So once again, in this novel, Dracula in some ways represents both Jesus Christ and the devil. And another thing that's interesting about Dracula in this book is Stoker leaves his origin very ambiguous. Now, if you are familiar with Vlad the Impaler, you do get subtle hints that perhaps the Dracula of the story is in fact the historical Dracula. At the same time, though, it still leaves a lot of it very ambiguous. Like, you do get some hints in the story that perhaps the Dracula family have made deals with the devil, and perhaps that's the origin of Dracula's vampirism. You also get a hint in this book that during Dracula's human lifetime, he was an alchemist. But to tie this in with Vlad the Impaler, there is a part in the beginning of the story where Harker is talking to Dracula, and Dracula starts telling him about all these historical wars, and he talks about these wars as if he's actually fought them himself. So you do get the hint that when Dracula was a human, perhaps he was a soldier. But once again, for the most part, Dracula's origin in this book is left very ambiguous. And with the character of Van Helsing in this book, you get sort of a commentary on the line between science and religion, because Van Helsing is a scientist, yet he's a deeply religious man, and he also believes in the supernatural. So maybe with this character, Stoker was trying to say that the line between science and religion is a lot more blurred than we think. But to be honest, I would say Dracula, Renfield, and Abraham Van Helsing are definitely the three most interesting characters from this novel. Now, once again, the book definitely has the theme of science and religion, and this idea that science and religion are a lot closer than we think. And there's also a lot of sexual themes in this novel as well, and a lot of critics have read into this book actually being a commentary on the fear of female sexuality. Now, at the time this book was published in Victorian England, women really were starting to move out of their traditional roles, and there was sort of a backlash against this from a lot of the male population, because there were a lot of men at this time who were kind of terrified by these new aggressive women, and they really didn't like the idea of women moving away from their traditional roles, which of course is ridiculous that there would be such a backlash against that, but that was the time this book was written. Like, in this novel, you have two prominent female characters. You have Lucy and you have Mina. Now, Lucy is portrayed as being a much more sexually liberated woman, whereas Mina is portrayed as being much more conservative. But whereas Lucy is much more sexually liberated, she's also portrayed in the novel as being kind of a ditz, whereas Mina is portrayed as being much more intelligent. And in the novel, and this is a spoiler, however the book is over 100 years old, so spoiler for a book that's over 100 years old, but Lucy does get turned into a vampire by Dracula, and when she becomes a vampire, she becomes much more of the aggressive female that I think a lot of men at the time were fearing. And when Lucy becomes a vampire, she starts attacking children, which really does go against the traditional role of a woman being motherly. Now, while there is some definite sexism in the book, Mina is still portrayed as, in my opinion, a pretty strong character. At the same time, though, she's definitely a woman of her time. And while Mina is very strong and independent and very intelligent, she is still very much submissive to her husband and even some of the other male characters in this story. And there are actually parts of this book where the male characters are talking about, we have to leave Mina out of these conversations about Dracula. This is just too much for a woman to bear. Lair, but we're men, and we can handle this. Like, I shit you not, there's lines of dialogue like that in the book. I am paraphrasing that, but the male characters in the book do say things like that, especially Van Helsing. Van Helsing says it actually a couple of times that because Mina's a woman, we really should leave her out of this conversation about hunting and killing Dracula. So there is some definite sexism in the book, which I don't particularly like, but then again, I am judging this from a 21st century perspective. I understand this book was written in the 19th century, so I do have to cut it some slack in that regard, but there is some blatant misogyny in the book, which once again, I don't particularly like, but it does bring up some really interesting questions about the role of women in this story. Now, while there are some misogynistic undertones in the story, I also saw the story as being sort of a commentary on male vulnerability. Like, in the parts of this book that really focus on Lucy, you realize that there are three men who are madly in love with Lucy: Dr. Stewart, Arthur, and Quincy, and Lucy practically has these men wrapped around her fingers, and these men are just weak in the knees for her, so there is sort of a commentary on male vulnerability. And I also saw Dracula as being sort of a commentary on toxic masculinity, because in a lot of ways what he's doing to both Lucy and Mina in this story is kind of rape in a way. So once again, the book definitely has a lot of complicated views on women, and you could really argue whether the book is feminist or if it's misogynistic. I lean more towards that the book is definitely kind of sexist, but once again, I understand it is a product of the time. Now, overall, once again, I do like this book, but I do think it's overlong, and you normally won't hear me say that about a book, because I've always believed that a book should be as long as it needs to be, but in the case of this book, I really do think this book would have benefited from having a few pages cut out. I think this is a story that honestly would have been better if it was shorter. And it is kind of slow-moving, so there is some stuff about the book that I don't like, and once again, some of the themes in the novel, while they're interesting, they're also kind of complicated as well. Like, the book's views on women do, in my opinion, border on sexism. So I really don't think it's a flawless novel by any means, but it is a book I recommend reading, and I will never deny that this is one of the most important novels of all time. And as I said before, even if you don't like this book, you have to respect this book because of how much of an impact it had. Now, Bram Stoker died in 1912, and Dracula is by far his most well-known work. However, he has written many other books before and after Dracula, but none of them had the same impact that Dracula had. Now, perhaps Stoker's most well-known novel outside of Dracula would be his 1911 novel, The Lair of the White Worm. Now, I have read that book, and I did a review of it a couple of years ago, and I remember I gave it a somewhat positive review, but looking back on that book, it's not really a book I have the desire to read again. Now, after Bram Stoker died, his wife published a collection of previously unpublished short stories by him, one of those short stories being Dracula's Guest, which sort of acts as a pseudo-prequel to Dracula. Now, Dracula's Guest was actually an excised chapter from the original novel that Bram Stoker's wife later published as a standalone story. Now, as I said before, Dracula was not the first vampire story, but in a lot of ways this has become the definitive vampire story. And honestly, I don't think there is a vampire story written after Dracula that wasn't in some ways influenced by Dracula. Like, even something like Richard Matheson's I Am Legend was in some ways influenced by Dracula, even though the actual story for that novel has nothing to do with Dracula. Also, the Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice were definitely influenced by Dracula, and even something like Twilight would probably not exist had it not been for Dracula. Once again, you'll be hard-pressed to find a vampire story written in the 20th or 21st centuries that wasn't in some ways influenced by Bram Stoker's novel. And the character of Count Dracula has appeared in more movies, books, and plays than just about any other fictional character. The only character to surpass Count Dracula in terms of the media that he's appeared in is actually Sherlock Holmes. Now, in the years since this novel was published, there have been various different play adaptations of this novel, but for a lot of people, Dracula is most famous through the movies that he's appeared in. Now, the first official adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula was F.W. Murnell's 1922 horror classic Nosferatu, but that actually wasn't the first Dracula movie, believe it or not. Prior to Nosferatu, there was a 1921 Hungarian film titled Dracula's Death. Now, I've never seen this movie because, unfortunately, Dracula's Death is now considered to be a lost film. Now, from what I've heard of that movie, Dracula's Death is not actually an adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel. It only takes the name Dracula. Besides the name, the story itself owes almost nothing to the original novel. I don't even know if Dracula was actually supposed to be a vampire in that movie, but that was the first Dracula movie. Unfortunately, the film is now lost, which is definitely a shame because the actual story for that movie sounded creepy as hell. Now, the first actual adaptation of Dracula was 1922's Nosferatu, which was directed by F.W. Murnell. Now, this was actually an unauthorized adaptation because F.W. Murnell could not get the rights to the novel from Bram Stoker's widow. Keep in mind that the book wasn't public domain at this point, and he actually made this movie without the permission from the people who at the time owned the copyrights to the book. So, in the original version of Nosferatu, they call him Count Orlok instead of Count Dracula. However, since it's a silent film, most newer versions of Nosferatu have just replaced the title cards and called him Count Dracula. And despite the fact that Murnell changed the names of the characters, this was not fooling Stoker's widow, and she actually tried to have all copies of this movie destroyed, but fortunately, some copies still survived. Now, Nosferatu is 95 years old, but for a film that's just 5 years shy of being 100 years old, I have to say that Nosferatu has some of the creepiest imagery that you will see in any horror film. Like, the imagery in the film is so surreal and so nightmarish, and Max Schreck is so freaking creepy in the role of Count Orlok or Count Dracula, depending on which version of the movie you watch. And despite the fact that this was an unauthorized adaptation of the novel, this was the first real adaptation of Dracula, so if it wasn't for this movie, we might not have some of the other adaptations of Dracula. And this is considered to be the first vampire movie, so I think horror fans and film buffs in general should be grateful that Stoker's widow did not succeed at her mission of destroying all copies of this film. And Nosferatu is actually where the whole idea of vampires being afraid of sunlight came from. Because contrary to popular belief, vampires were not always killed by sunlight. Like, there's nothing like that in the book, and to the best of my knowledge, there's nothing like that in vampire stories that predate Dracula. Really, the whole idea of vampires being killed by the sun started with Nosferatu. But now that whole idea is considered to be a staple in vampire lore. And Nosferatu is not just one of the most important horror films of all time, but it's one of the most important films in general. Now, the movie spawned a remake in 1979, and there was also a 2000 film titled Shadow of the Vampire, which was a fictional story about the making of Nosferatu, and that whole movie played on the idea that what if Max Schreck, the actor who played Dracula in that movie, actually was a vampire. Now, perhaps the most famous adaptation of Dracula is the 1931 film, which was produced by Universal and directed by Todd Browning, and of course starred Bela Lugosi as the Count. Now, this was the second film adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel, third if you count Dracula's death, but this was the first authorized film adaptation, because this time Universal actually did get the rights to the novel. Keep in mind that at this point the novel still wasn't public domain. And the 1931 version of Dracula had a huge influence, not just on horror films, but on pop culture and really culture in general. And Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula is easily the most famous portrayal of the character, and I think it's what most people think of when they think Dracula. And even people who have no idea who Bela Lugosi is, the minute you show them an image of him as Dracula in that movie, they'll instantly recognize it as Dracula. And the whole look for Dracula in that film, which is not exactly how Dracula was described in the book, is easily the most famous look for the character, and I think it's what most people think of when they think Dracula. And it was definitely Bela Lugosi's Dracula that influenced pop culture, like stuff like the Count from Sesame Street and Count Chocula was definitely inspired by Bela Lugosi's portrayal of the character of Dracula. And it's somewhat ironic that Bela Lugosi's Dracula is easily the most famous Dracula because he only played the character twice in film. He did play the character a lot on stage, but as far as movies go, he's only played the character twice. However, he did play similar characters in the films Mark of the Vampire and Return of the Vampire, but neither of the characters he played in those movies were actually Dracula. But once again, the 1931 version of Dracula is easily the most famous adaptation of this story, and that same year there was also a Spanish version of the movie. Now, the 1931 adaptation of Dracula actually had a couple of sequels made to it. In 1936, there was Dracula's Daughter. In 1943, there was Son of Dracula. Now, in Son of Dracula, Lon Chaney Jr. played Dracula. However, in the movie, he called himself Alucard, which was Dracula spelt backwards. Now, it's been years since I've seen this movie, and I don't remember if Lon Chaney Jr.'s character in the movie was actually supposed to be Dracula's son, or if he was supposed to be Dracula himself. I don't even remember if it was really explained in the movie or not. Following Son of Dracula, there was House of Frankenstein, which was a crossover with Universal's Frankenstein series and the Wolfman series. Then there was House of Dracula, which was a sequel to House of Frankenstein, and once again, it was a crossover with the Universal Frankenstein series and the Wolfman series. Now, in both these movies, John Carradine played Count Dracula, and this won't be the last time that John Carradine played the character. And then the final film of Universal's Dracula series was Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which was a horror comedy, and it was both a sequel and a spoof to all the Universal monster movies, and it was a crossover between the Universal Dracula series, the Universal Frankenstein series, and the Wolfman series. And Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein was the second time that Bela Lugosi played the character on film. Now, I'm not going to cover every single adaptation of Dracula because then this video would be like 5 hours long, but I want to touch on certain key ones, but also name some more obscure ones as well. Now, one of my personal favorite adaptations of Dracula is 1958's The Horror of Dracula, which was produced by British film studio Hammer, and it starred Christopher Lee as Dracula and Peter Cushing as Van Helsing. And Christopher Lee is so iconic in the role of Dracula in that movie, and honestly, he might actually be my favorite film Dracula. And Peter Cushing, for me, is the definitive Van Helsing. And The Horror of Dracula kickstarted the Hammer Dracula series, which includes The Brides of Dracula, Dracula Prince of Darkness, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, Taste the Blood of Dracula, Scars of Dracula, Dracula AD 1972, The Satanic Rites of Dracula, and The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. Now, I'm a huge fan of the Hammer Dracula films, and my personal favorites of that series are The Horror of Dracula and The Satanic Rites of Dracula. In 1966, there was Billy the Kid versus Dracula, where John Carradine once again played Dracula. However, this film shared no continuity with the Universal films. In 1970, there was the Jess Franco adaptation, Count Dracula, where Christopher Lee once again played Dracula. However, this film is unconnected to the Hammer films. Christopher Lee actually played Dracula several times in other films that are unconnected to the Hammer Dracula series. Like, he appeared as Dracula in the comedy film The Magic Christian. He also appeared as Dracula in the comedy film One More Time. You also had the blaxploitation films Blackula and Scream Blackula Scream, which were both about an African prince who gets turned into a vampire by Dracula. Another really well-known adaptation of Dracula is the 1979 version with Frank Langella as Dracula. And I guess 1979 was sort of the year of Dracula, because that same year you also had the remake of Nosferatu. That same year you also had the Stephen King adaptation, Salem's Lot, which is kind of a Dracula movie and kind of not at the same time. Like, the book Salem's Lot was basically Stephen King's version of Dracula, even though the vampire in that story was called Kurt Barlow. Barlow was basically Stephen King's version of Dracula. And also that same year you had a porno film called Dracula Sucks. So, once again, it seems like 1979 was sort of the year of Dracula. Once again, I am skipping over a lot of Dracula movies. I'm just naming specific ones. Now, one of my personal favorite Dracula movies is one that a lot of people wouldn't consider to be a Dracula movie, because the vampire in the movie is not actually called Dracula, but the film is so clearly inspired by not just Bram Stoker's novel, but other adaptations of Dracula as well. So, I personally do consider this movie to be unofficially a Dracula movie, but that is 1985's Fright Night. And Fright Night is one of my all-time favorite horror films, and Jerry Dandridge in that movie is basically Dracula. Another one of my favorite Dracula movies is The Monster Squad, which was a tribute to the Universal monster movies. Now, even though Christopher Lee is my favorite person to have played Dracula, my personal favorite adaptation of Dracula is the 1992 Francis Ford Coppola version. Now, the Francis Ford Coppola version of Bram Stoker's Dracula is freaking excellent, and it has Gary Oldman as Dracula and Anthony Hopkins as Abraham Van Helsing. It also stars Winona Ryder as Mina, and it stars Keanu Reeves as Jonathan Harker. But yeah, Bram Stoker's Dracula is an excellent movie, and it's my personal favorite adaptation of this novel, and it's also one of the few adaptations of Dracula that actually does follow the book. You also had the 2000 film Dracula 2000, which is not a great movie by any means, but it does have one of the most unique takes on the whole Dracula mythos I've ever seen in any movie, and that movie actually had 2 sequels made to it. You also had the 2004 film Van Helsing, which had Hugh Jackman as Van Helsing, and it was basically sort of an action hero take on the character of Van Helsing, and in that movie, he battled Dracula, the Frankenstein monster, and the Wolfman. There was also Dario Argento's adaptation of Dracula, which I haven't seen yet, but I heard it really wasn't that good. There was also the 2014 film Dracula Untold, which was sort of an attempt to reboot the Universal Dracula series, but the movie really didn't do too well in the box office. Now, I know I named a lot of Dracula movies there, but believe me, there are a lot more out there. Like, there are so many different movies that feature the character of Dracula, and most of them aren't even adaptations of Bram Stoker's novel. Most of them only use the character of Dracula. Dracula has also appeared in TV shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I know he was a character on that show Penny Dreadful. There was also a manga series and an anime called Helsing, and basically the premise of this anime is Dracula was defeated by Van Helsing, and as a result he started working for Van Helsing's family as a vampire hunter, and in that series Dracula called himself Alucard, which is Dracula spelt backwards, which was probably taken from Son of Dracula. And there have been various different Dracula TV shows. There have also been Dracula comic books as well. Like in the 70s, you had the Tomb of Dracula series from Marvel, which is actually where the character of Blade originated. And the Tomb of Dracula comics made Dracula a character in the Marvel universe, and Marvel's version of Dracula has had crossovers with Spider-Man and the X-Men. There was also a Batman Elseworld graphic novel titled Batman and Dracula Red Reign, where Batman actually battled Count Dracula, and that graphic novel actually had 2 sequels written to it. Also, Alan Moore made the character of Mina from this book a character in his comic book series, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Dracula has also appeared in other works of literature by other authors, like Richard Matheson wrote a Dracula story entitled Blood Son, which was about a kid who thought he was the son of Dracula. You also had the Stephen King novel Salem's Lot, which was not really a Dracula story because the vampire in that novel was called Kurt Barlow, but that book was definitely based on Bram Stoker's Dracula. You also had a book called The Historian, which was about Dracula. You also had a book called Dracula the Undead, which was written a few years ago, which was actually written by, I think, the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker, and it was written as sort of an official sequel to Bram Stoker's original novel. But yeah, once again, this book left behind a tremendous legacy. Like, there have been countless movies, books, and plays, and comic books that have featured the character of Dracula, and it all originated with this novel. So yeah, that was my review on Dracula by Bram Stoker, and bye.